Welcome to another episode of Judgment Date. As you know, these programs, which we've been doing for some while now, are all about trying to examine issues with regard to the lockdown and the following consequences following the lockdown, trying to give people some food for thought and debate in a difficult time where we're all very anxious. And today, I'm very privileged to have Trevor Manuel speaking to me. Of course, Trevor was in the first cabinet of Mr. Mandela back in the day in 94 as the Minister of Trade and Industry, and then I think for 13 years, if I'm correct, the Minister of Finance, and has done a whole range of things subsequent thereto. Trevor, thank you very much for being part of this. And I wonder, given your experience, whether I could start just as a simple kind of question. I mean, what's it like being in a cabinet when you're in such a crisis? I mean, people are obviously under enormous pressure, but I'm just trying to sense, you were there, you've been under all these crises. What's it like, for ordinary people don't seem to understand what it must be like to actually be there around that table in a crisis of this kind?
Look, I mean, I can't pretend to have lived through anything like this.
Yeah.
Because we had a series of different issues. The Mandela years were kind of golden years. They were interesting because they were about constitution making initially and then rolling out implementation. And then we moved into the Mbeki era, and that was quite different. And across those two, of course, we dealt with interesting, if legally complex issues like the strategic arms procurement. And we dealt with a period during which the deputy president was initially suspended and then dismissed. And so those were different kind of challenges. But this is intensity at a different level. Also bear in mind that I'm not quite sure what the relationship between the Command Council and the Cabinet is. But my reading of this is that Cabinet remains responsible. It can't devolve itself of the responsibility for decision making in the current crisis. And I think it's that needs to work through. How do we remain true to the Constitution yet be able to deal with the exigencies of a national lockdown created under the Disaster Management Act? It's very, very hard to do all of this. Also, I think that what is happening at the present is that President Ramaphosa has global responsibilities, and you've seen this in respect of his own interventions in the quest for a vaccine. You've seen it in the role that he plays as chair of the African Union. But then he's also head of state and head of government. So it's a multiplicity of roles that makes it very, very complex, because you've got to deal with all of these things simultaneously. And I think it's quite important that we retain a view of that as well.
And don't you, if I recall correctly, haven't you been appointed to some role in relation to COVID-19?
Yes, there are 5 of us who've been appointed AU envoys to try and deal with a few issues. The first issue is to try and ensure that there are financial resources to ensure that every country on the African continent has adequate resources to deal with the COVID-19. So that's the first task. The second task is to prevent the outflow of resources by trying to support countries in their endeavors to prevent debt settlement or debt service costs. And a number of institutions have already agreed to kind of 2-year suspension of debt service. And then the third issue would be to remain with countries on the continent and ensure that we can try and reignite the economies across the continent. Now, if one takes the last issue first, if you pause for a moment and reflect on the fact that the all African economies are very vulnerable because the sources of revenue on the continent are firstly commodities, mineral resources, and petroleum, importantly, also agricultural output, but that's pretty devastated by drought in some parts and by locusts in others. Then we have tourism receipts, which have dried up. You have remittances that have dried up. And ODA is under pretty severe pressure. And part of what we're trying to do on the continent is to unlock the gates to allow ODA flows back in. But most countries are likely to be devastated for quite some time, and it's quite important to understand that. As you tie that up with the first issue, what is happening at the moment is that smaller countries are being squeezed out by large countries who are trying to not just get to the front of the queue, but also to monopolize everything. So it's happening on the African continent with access to medication, to PPE, to test kits, and so on. But it's also happening in other countries. I mean, just yesterday, there was a request from states in Brazil to Ethiopian Airlines to run flights to Brazil from Addis to ensure that there's medication delivered there, because there have been instances where Brazilian, Ecuadorian, and Chilean planes that have had equipment for COVID-19 on board have actually had these removed on the runways and then transferred to European countries and certainly to the United States. So all of this is happening at the same time. And I think we need to be alive to all of it, and not much of it reaches the press every day.
So just on that point, before I get on to the economy, I mean, what is your view if they find a vaccine? What happens to a country like ours? I mean, are we ever going to get any of that stuff for the purposes of being able to help our own population?
Well, the big change between what happened previously and the present is the notions of intellectual property. I mean, pause for a moment. In 1970, vaccine was developed, could become part of what we have, and there's no longer competition about who has access to the flu vaccine. But you look at what's happening at the moment, even foreign companies, I mean, AstraZeneca, which is nominally a British company, the Trump administration has put $1 billion into AstraZeneca to try and get them to chase up and ensure that there is a vaccine available to the United States. Similarly, Sanofi, which is a French company, has already made a commitment to provide for the US first. And you'll remember that earlier in the COVID saga, the US tried to buy a German company so that it provide for the US first. So the notion of MAGA, Make America Great Again, is in fact America first, America alone. And smaller countries are going to be squeezed out. And I think that's a challenge that confronts us now. It's very different, Dennis, from what you had in 2009, because after Lehman Brothers went down and there was an initiative to convene the G20 heads of state, which was actually George W. Bush in October of 2008. But by the time it got to April 2009, heads of state convened in London. Gordon Brown hosted that, but by then Barack Obama was president of the United States. And you look at all of the assembled heads of state who took a serious set of responsibilities for dealing with the financial crisis of 2008. They came together. They took decisions in global interest. In fact, of all of the G20 heads of state who were around then, there's only one that remains. Is very different. And that is Erdogan in Turkey. Everybody else is one. And I think this makes the situation so difficult at the moment. Also, even if you look at the nominal relationship groups within it, within the G20, BRICS was formidably important. But Brazil, and you see the conduct of Bolsonaro in support of Trump rather than in support of the people of Brazil and the South, And similarly, you see the conduct of Prime Minister Modi in India and his alignment with Donald Trump rather than as part of the global South. So I think that we're faced with very real challenges in the context of COVID-19 and the
Yeah.
issues of just the impact of globalization.
So let me move the conversation a bit then to South Africa. I mean, you were Minister of Finance for 13 years. What would you do? What prospects do you see for us recovering?
Well, I think in the first instance, it's quite important to look at the fiscal balances, and the most recent forecasts for the deficit in South Africa are in the order of 15.2%.
Yeah,
now that's massive. I mean, we could run a very tight ship. And in fact, in 2007, going into the crisis, because we anticipated the crisis, we were able to do it with a fiscal surplus. 15.2% deficit, it's massive, but I don't think it would be an outlier in the context of COVID-19. You look at the U.S. Deficit numbers. You look at how it's creeping up. I don't know if the Senate has already rejected the second installment of $3 trillion of relief, but Congress has passed that. But these are massive amounts of money, and so across the world, I think you're going to see great demand for debt, and again the squeeze out, and so. I think the key issue is whether Tito Mboweni, as finance minister, will also be able to convene other colleagues around them so that African countries and smaller countries aren't squeezed out as the giants try and get access to finance for their own debt. And this is going to happen across Europe, and it's going to happen certainly in the context of the United States, and this will have a profound impact on what finance is available for debt and the price thereof. Bear in mind that Europe is also battling. They can't find a united position to even launch something like a coronavirus bond. And so all of this, I think, will play out. So the debt issue, I think, is going to be fundamentally important. The tax issues are going to be important because tax revenues are going to remain under the severest of pressure because the economy is flat on its back. And so the question, I think, that should be uppermost in the mind of the Minister of Finance is, what do we do to rebuild growth opportunities? Because the lockdown is important, and its import would be drawn from whether it's used for education or whether it appears to be an end in itself. But beyond that, I think it's how economic growth is stimulated and redeveloped going forward.
Trevor, I think we got up to the point of the debt. So I wanted to ask you before we get on to tax. Does that then mean that we would need to, we're going to have to go to someone like the IMF?
I think that there's no doubt that given the scale of what we need urgently, we will have to knock on a few doors. The IMF, and I think I've heard a number of something in the order of $4 billion from the IMF. There's also the New Development Bank, the so-called BRICS Bank, and I know that there's been discussion, there's been a request, and that might be in the order of $1.5 billion. Then there may be the other institutions as well, like the World Bank and the IMF. What has happened for a number of African countries, but is unlikely to happen for South Africa, is the suspension of debt service payments. And so that remains continuous, and that's also a function of the fact that the bulk of our debt is still domestic, and the state owes the pension funds, and once the state seeks reprieve from that, I think we're going to see the pension funds in general and pensioners in particular actually being sacrificed in the process of that. And for
What
all
does
of
that
these,
mean? What does that mean for people's savings?
It means that you have a very rapid erosion of savings. It was, in fact, a discussion. It's an interesting discussion that I had with Madiba when I just became Minister of Finance, because you may recall that going into '94, the deficit was about 8.5%, and
I remember very well. I was with you when that happened. I remember being
right.
shocked by the figures. Yes, absolutely, yeah.
Right, and Madiba's view was so this debt service cost may become the largest item on our budget. And I said yes, and he said, what do we do about it? I said, look, we have to look at how we recalibrate. He said, so the state owes money. Do you think I should call Harry and Anton, being Harry Oppenheimer and Anton Rupert, whose offspring are involved now as donors into the circumstance? And we pointed out, that our capital markets actually involve payment owed to contributors as workers. And he said, we must never touch the workers' money in this country. And so that helped us get along. And that was, in fact, one of the starts of what became GEAR, because we had to reduce the deficit and take a view that would place a firmer hold on current expenditure in government. So all of those things came together in a particular and distinct kind of way.
But you thought a lot about this, obviously, and I mean, since you've left government, there's been a really tepid growth. I mean, growth has been pretty pathetic over the last number of years. I'm not suggesting that's because because you've gone, we've got no growth. But the fact is...
But you may say it.
Okay, I'm prepared to say that. But what I also want to say, but then you see, that comes to the catch. That means, how do we get growth back? Because surely we can live with a deficit if we, over the next 2 or 3 years, start growing seriously.
Yeah, that I think is the biggest challenge that confronts us, because if one looks at large parts of our economy, there was organic development over the past 30 years or so. You look at tourism in South Africa, it currently, I mean, at last count, and this could have been sort of late last year, employed about 1.5 million people in the South African economy, contributed a large sum, and these vary depending on whether you use the Stats SA figures, and they've got what they call tourism satellite accounts, or if you use the kind of industry figures, but generally around 250 billion, give or take, contribution to GDP. And tourism is going to remain probably one of the last movers. And that'll have, I mean, when you consider that, consider the fact also that not many people are going to be rushing to fly around, even within the country. And the numbers could be down 80% in last year globally. That is flights. If you look at accommodation, you look at road transport, and altogether, I think it'll have a profound impact. Now, what we have as a tourism sector was developed, I mean, it's been there, and the Kruger National Park has been there for over a century. But what you have, all told, including a very smart restaurant sector and so on, all of it has developed organically. I mean, you couldn't think back 30 years when you really battled to get a decent coffee shop anywhere in South Africa. So these things have developed, and suddenly they're no longer there. And the interesting challenge of this is that the bulk of it, if you take out the large hotel chains and so on, the bulk of it is actually small and medium, frequently mom and pop shops. And there's very little support available to them. And that is a big challenge. So that's there. I think that the construction sector has been dead since certainly post the 2010 FIFA World Cup and the action taken by the Competition Commission and Tribunal against construction companies. They've really battled, and so construction, which frequently is a leader in facilitating infrastructure development, unless there's some concentration that goes into that, I think it's going to be difficult. The mining companies have started, but you're also seeing that the infection is still very much alive. So a mine opens, there's infection, everybody has to be removed, the mine shuts down, there has to be deep cleansing. It's very hard, especially in sectors such as mining, to try and develop sustainable growth with stop-start productivity. I mean, these are big challenges.
You've put your finger on something. I mean, it doesn't matter whether you have a lockdown or not a lockdown. You're not going to get the tourism industry back whilst COVID's around, unless we've got a vaccine, a therapeutic or something, because people aren't going to travel. They're going to be scared. So
they're going to be scared. But if you see, Dennis, I mean, you travel between cities in this country very frequently. So let's assume that on a trip to Johannesburg, you generally tend to stay in one of the sort of top 5-star hotels. Now you come along.
I stay very modestly.
Now you come along, and the hotel has to look at you and consider what happens.
Yeah.
If 3 weeks later you've tested positive, and the only place that you could have been infected is in that fancy hotel.
Yeah.
The risk of being sued by a judge is a big risk. And so what are they going to do? How are they going to conduct their business? What happens to their costs relative to the income of the hotel sector? And where do the first movers come from as you try and re-stimulate a sector like tourism?
So where do you put your attention now in the light of that? And you're trying to get the economy going. Where would you put your energy in order to move this economy along, so that we don't sit in 5 years' time with a sort of disaster on our hands when the economy hasn't grown at all?
Look, I mean, some of these are going to be difficult calls because you have to call by sector. Globally, I know that tourism is a larger contributor to total output than the auto sector, for instance. But for reasons that we now have touched on, tourism is likely to be a very late mover in the reconstruction of economies. If you say autos, and I know that just recently the Premier of Gauteng visited a couple of auto plants and so on, but if you say autos because it's always been big in South Africa, consider the fact that you're dealing with a few issues. The first is oversupply. And I know Volkswagen in Germany have a problem because they can't produce any more cars because they have nowhere to store. They have nowhere to store because nobody's buying cars at the moment anywhere in the world. So you're dealing with that at the same time as you're dealing with what may emerge as a very significant technology shift away from the internal combustion engine to electric powered vehicles. So all of these things happening at the same time presents very real challenges. But I think that it would be in some of the sectors that are more labor absorbing, but there are also going to be challenges. I mean, just pause for a moment and recognize that one of the fruits of globalization has been the growth of certain industries in countries that had previously not featured on the map. I mean, I was reading recently about over 100,000 garment workers in Myanmar who have now been laid off because there's no demand. Myanmar, Bangladesh, Pakistan, the global clothing industry and textile industry in those countries is a fairly new phenomenon. It's been a massive source of revenue. But it happened at the expense of the loss of the textile sector in the Carolinas in the US, for instance. So what's going to happen from here? These are fundamentally important questions that also require cool heads and global leadership to be able to resolve these matters.
All right. So something that's worried me is that over the last number of years, we've fussed around in relation to an economic policy that could get long before COVID. Now, what you're telling me, which I think makes absolute sense, is that we've got an even larger challenge. So we're going to have to be very careful about, and very strategic about what kind of economic policies we can start to develop, because what you've described already is we're going to have to borrow. We've got a shrinking tax base, and we've got significant parts of the economy that aren't going to grow, whether we lock down or let everything go. That's a hell of a challenge going ahead.
Look, I also think that we need some certainty about what can be done. I think one of the terrible risks of COVID-19 and the idea of level 4 and so on has been that you've had a very heavy hand of government in determining what can be sold and what can't be sold. Now, I don't know of anywhere else in the world where this has happened or where it could happen with any degree of success. It's a major, major problem. It's a fiasco.
Explain to me, what is in the mindset here? What's going on here? You know these people.
No, the people you knew are not the people who are there now. I was on a roadshow recently, and one of the analysts said that he thinks that some of the ministers are enjoying the power of the Disaster Management Act a bit too much. But it's a very strange kind of thing. Why would you decree that particular kinds of clothes can't be sold or particular stores can't open? Why would you do that? Surely it's better to have an agreed negative list of things that really cannot be sold. It's going to be a shorter list. It's going to be a list that can be explained more rationally than what you've seen just in the last period. But it doesn't take away anything from government. It doesn't take away anything from industry. In fact, it's likely to produce a much better working relationship between business on the one hand, government on the other hand. And I think the trade unions are also likely to be aligned to that process.
So, Trevor, when I listen to you, I mean, I'm not flattering you. I worked for you, so I know this. I can speak with confidence about this. I mean, you were the best finance minister we had, and you were there for many, many years. Now, you
can't pay the bribe, Dennis.
No, you don't even. I can't even buy you a cup of tea for this. Or that's saying to you, people listening to you saying, "Here's a guy who really ran the economy for 13 years, knows what he's talking about. Whole lifetime of dedication to struggle. Now he's telling us that he can't understand this either. I mean, that's like enough to drive ordinary people to drink if they could get any."
Yes, it has to be. But the other issue that I've
So what's going on? I mean, how do we get? I mean, what I'm trying to say is we can't afford that. We haven't got the luxury of this kind of policy uncertainty going forward.
But there's nothing about that side of it, the trade and industry stuff, that we can afford. But I think that we should also be careful that the security apparatus doesn't take control of what needs to happen. I'm very convinced. I mean, and this is not a comment on the lockdown. It's a comment on the fact that we must have measures that are appropriate to circumstance. The issue that we haven't invested in is proper education. I have seen countries where they have people with bibs who are designated social distance marshals. They go out there, they help people, they explain to people. And in a country like South Africa, we have to do this in vernacular languages.
Yes.
So that's a very different role from taking 75,000 soldiers who are very expensive and deploying them with R5 rifles into townships. It's a different need. Because you start with a health problem, but it will become a security issue. And I think a security issue would be exceedingly costly to take on, in addition to providing for sustainable livelihoods for many people who've been lost, who've been squashed out of the economy now, and resources that are needed reinvigorate life into this economy. So these are, I think, the choices that government has to exercise. We've got to talk
we have
out.
we have to make those choices as a country, don't we? Because, I mean, what you're really describing is either a control system which is antithetical to the constitutional democratic vision, or a constitutional democratic vision whereby, in a sense, you have exactly the kind of methodology that you're talking about, where people are treated as citizens with respect and dignity.
I think that those are very binary choices, and I think that we're on the wrong side of that movement. And I think that in the recent Khosa judgment, Judge Fabricius was actually abundantly clear about it. He also made an obiter comment about the clothing issue, but his primary issues were about the use of force against people, which is quite unnecessary and abusive. I mean, the idea that there must be something in the order of 150,000 South Africans who've had to pay admission of guilt fines for nominally breaking the lockdown regulations by selling achar or following your child onto the beach, or strange things like that, where we're making criminals out of people. That cannot be the intention of an endeavor to prevent the spread of COVID-19.
I agree entirely. I'm running out of time. I want to ask you one final question, because you've had lots of experience in the international community. And I know this is binary, but people talk about either the world moving inward, like Donald Trump, and you've mentioned that earlier, or more globally, looking for global cooperation. COVID-19 finally starts to dissipate. Will we move more inwardly, nationalistically, or will there be a greater impetus for international governance?
I think that we're at a very low ebb of global governance at the moment. And this is because you've got a leader in the White House who doesn't care, and he has a Secretary of State who is as pig-headed as he is about these issues. You've got Europe that won't come together. You've got China, which has been vilified and which happens to be holding its Congress of the People now. But China always takes a long, non-aggressive view on these kinds of issues. But the world needs rationality, and it needs balance in the way in which resources are provided, the way in which technology, medication, and support for frontline workers like PPE is provided. That's what we need in the immediate. But I think it also calls for a different approach to governance. I don't think it's all negative. I think that the alignment of heads of state who convened recently to look at public ownership of a vaccine is a fundamentally important start. The exclusion, I think the most important exclusion from that is the Trump administration, and there might be some acolytes, including Bolsonaro and Modi, who go along with that. But I think that for the rest, even though there may be political differences, you're probably going to be able to have some basis to take issues forward. And I think using institutions like the G20, even without Donald Trump, is going to be important to just maintain some sense of equilibrium in what the world needs to govern itself going forward from here.
Thank you very much. I've run out of time, which is a pity, because we could carry on for another hour. And these are very, very important questions. And I mean, I'm not quite sure what I take away from that. I take a lot away from this, but I'm not sure whether I'm supposed to be upbeat or downbeat. But what I think is that you're right. These are the challenges that, in fact, face us, I think. And when the president talks about the third phase, about the sort of economic policies that government wants to put in place, seems to me, from what you're talking about, that becomes absolutely essential to our future in so many ways. So, Trevor Manuel, thank you very much. It's always very good to hear from you, and thank you for giving us your time, and stay safe.
Thank you very much, Judge, and thanks to Daily Maverick for hosting us.